we are in the last of the pieces of Genesis 1 through 11, and I like this. But I need to show you something that comes from the little book, The Lion, the Witch, the Wardrobe. This is the dedication that C.S. Lewis wrote for his goddaughter. Yeah, this series, this message today is blah, 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 a story fit for kids, but really for adults. That's where we're going. I'm just telegraphing that to you right now. Okay, next slide. Yeah, my dear Lucy, I wrote this story for you, but when I began it, I had not realized that little girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you are already too old for fairy tales, and by the time it's printed and bound, you will be older still. But someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. You can then take it down from some upper shelf, dust it, and tell me what you think of it. I shall probably be too deaf to hear and too old to understand a word you say, but I shall still be your affectionate godfather. How sweet. Here's my point in showing you this. Sometimes children's stories say best what's to be said. And Genesis 1 through 11, kids love those stories. In Sunday school, they color in those black outlines. They act it out. They love it. But there comes a time when you need to say, good night, kids, off to bed. And you pull out the chocolate mousse and maybe pour a great cup of good coffee or open the bottle of wine, and you read this story again as an adult. And this story today, it's good. It is really, really good, at least to my mind. But let me start it off for you. Genesis 11, verses 1 through 9. Now, Leanne was going to read it especially for you today, but last night she got home and goes, my throat is sore. I don't think I can do it. I don't know if she's really telling the truth. You never know with Leanne, but here we go. Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. That's Babylon, just to let you know. And they had brick for stone. Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people and they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispensed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there, the Lord dispensed them all over the face of the earth. Maybe you've heard that story before. And like I said, kids love this. It's just a funny story. All of a sudden, people can't understand each other. Great story. But, and you knew there was a but coming, didn't you? But just a chapter earlier, when it's talking about the grandsons and the grandsons and the grandsons of Noah, it says, well, let me show you in this verse 5 there. From these, the coastland people spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans in their nations. And you go, hold it, Phil. Something's wrong there, because we're going to read in chapter 11 that everybody spoke the same language. And here it looks like there are all sorts of languages out there. Is this a mistake? When it was to be edited, is this an oops? Or is there something more going on? There is. Let me explain it a little bit with this slide. Hebrew writers are so crafty when they put the scriptures together. All sorts of things that they slipped into the text. Puns, tremendously funny, hilarious puns. Another thing that they did is repeated words. And interesting with this one is that it starts off, verse 1, the whole earth. Verse 9, the whole earth. 3 more times in the middle of it, the whole earth is repeated. That's 5 times. Ding, 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 ding. When you have something repeated 5 times, it suggests it's a little bit like a flare going off, going, please pay attention to this. This is very important. That's what's part of what's going on here. There's also one other thing going on. I don't know how to call this. Let's go back to that previous slide. Words inverted. And the way I can maybe explain this is with a bumper sticker. Imagine I had a bumper sticker that said, "Dog is love." And the first time you see that, you go, what? Isn't it supposed to be God is love? But dog and God can be reversed. And maybe this person is saying, well, actually, my golden retriever is more reliable for love than God is. And the person is making a theological statement there. You get it, right? In inverted words. That is taking place here. Because the word for bricks is NVL. The word for confuse is LVN. That's a little bit of a flare going off, maybe suggesting that bricks, this new technology, can be more confusing than we think. Oh my goodness. So let's back up to that repeated words, because this is going to make this is so fascinating to me, because it isn't the only time when you see the whole earth repeated. It actually is repeated in that earlier story of Noah and the flood. We keep reading the whole earth, the whole earth, the whole earth. What's going on? Moses, or whoever wrote it, means for us to put those stories side by side. They're meant to be kind of alternatives of what happens when people turn their back on God and come up with all sorts of creative mechanisms to walk away from God. Well, in the story of Noah and the flood, the problem is that people were given this incredible freedom, and they just walked away from commitments and promises and justice to do everything that they wanted, and that didn't turn out well. And then this one, it's kind of the mere opposite of that. Instead of freedom to do anything that they want, it's all about control. So instead of chaos with the first story, we're going to control everything, the language, all of the people together, and we're going to build these big things. Freedom and control. And in that, I kind of signaled where we're going. So I need to go back to that first verse again. Verse 1 of chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. What's interesting about that is that on the surface, if you're reading it as a child, you think it's saying, well, the whole world had only one language and that was it, and God divided them up. But what really is going on is another Hebrew technique of kind of summarizing everything that had taken place. So we're going to go from this verse backing up to tell us what really had happened. And it says, they had come in from the east. And we're not told who the they is. At first, we think it's the offspring of Noah, but even in that is a clue. Because earlier, when Noah and his family land, the text actually says that they head off to the west and the north and the south. Whoever this is comes in from the east, the opposite direction. And when they come in, this new group of people, they dominate. They force everybody to adopt one language. And they introduce all of this new technology. And I think that what is going on here is Moses is warning people about the dangers of empire, colonial control, because instead of making it better for them, it's going to set them up for failure. The text says that first they had bricks. That was one kind of technology. They poured clay into molds and let them dry, and then they could build with them. And then the technology improved. And they figured out how they could use tar or bitumen to make those bricks waterproof. And then they came up with an even better piece of technology, firing those bricks. And now, if you were part of the elites or you were part of the wealthy, you could build homes that were impervious to the flooding. It was great. All of that technology is a wonderful thing. And finally, somebody says, how about we build a temple? Now, what they're really talking about is something, well, like this little picture here. Next slide. And there's somebody, we don't know his name, let's call him Earl, who says, let's make it the tallest one. 300 feet. It's going to be great. It's going to do three things. Number one, it will reach heaven. And he doesn't mean just tall. What that implied was that if we can get to heaven, that means that we can somehow influence God or the gods. So that's number one. Second thing Earl says is it will make us famous. Doesn't that drive so much of our lives? We want kind of to be noticed, to have this fame. Number three, he says, it will make us impervious. Nobody will be able to touch us. We'll be so secure. Our destiny will be locked in. Sounds like a great idea, right? And then, verse 5. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. Now, there is something so hilarious here, but it goes right over our heads. We miss it. God has to come down from what they thought was so high. God has to come down to see this piddly little thing that they had done. So much for reaching the heavens. God isn't impressed. Now, here is an aside. In the archaeological work of ziggurats, what they have found on top quite often is this phrase, to the heavens. So this fits historically with what's going on. But that's not all. Next slide. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be supposed to be an I in there, impossible for them. Now, when I read that, doesn't it sound to you, at least a little bit, like God's nervous? He's a little anxious of what they may do with this. What's interesting about this is that if you go back to Genesis 3, you also read, there's a sentence where it sounds like God is anxious there too. Here it is. He, and it's God talking about Adam and Eve, he could become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand, take also from the tree of life and eat. So it's interesting that in both at the front of Genesis 1 through 11, at the end of it, you have God reading into the future, reflecting on the possibilities if mankind is allowed to continue doing what they are already doing. It isn't going to lead to good things. It's going to become deadly. So rather than this being something working against God. It really is showing God's ability to see into the future and to exercise judgment. Next slide. So let us go down, verse 7. Let us go down and there confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispensed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Now this is going to be the sentence that is levied, but there's one more detail I want to suggest from this. When you look at a ziggurat, looks like a stair step, right? And some people have looked on and said, isn't that amazing? It's people trying to reach out to God. It's the religious sense inside of them reaching out to the divine. The problem is, that's not how the people of Mesopotamia viewed it. It wasn't for man climbing up. It was God climbing down. And at the bottom of it would be food. Every day they set a new table. And how it was viewed is, how can we set the table right? How can we leverage or manipulate God to get God down on our side? So we're going to build a temple high enough that he can somehow come down from the heavens to us and we feed him. And it makes for a transactional relationship where we can manipulate or we can use God and we can get him on our side doing our bidding. It's not about worship at all. It's almost the opposite of that. How can we use religion to serve our own purposes? So God looks on and he says, no, this isn't going to be allowed to continue on. This world of control where everybody has been forced into using one language and building our technology, we're going to blow that apart. And if you go to Iraq today, that's kind of what you see. Is where all of those grand designs fell apart, no longer used. And you go, well, Phil, what do we do with this? How does it connect into our world? Because let's not leave it just like a little children's story. Well, I want to come back to what I said earlier, that I'm pretty convinced that what this was originally meant to do was to say to a group of immigrants, to a group of expats, be very wary of the world that you're living in right now. You're going to come up against people who want to coerce you to give up your language, your folk ways, your faith, because they are trying to build a new master world where they are in control, where they have great power, where they are convinced they can make things happen. Be wary of the promises of people who speak big dreams like that, because instead of helping you, it may do just the opposite. It may enslave you. And so I step back from that and I say, okay, are there ways that we are watching this unfold today? Well, I certainly have, Leanne and I observed it firsthand in the country where we were for 4 years. It's one of the most populous countries on the earth, and just for video's sake, I'm not going to name names on that, but one of the first things that we saw the new prime minister do was come in, and where everybody came to the major cities with their own folk languages and their village languages, those got tossed out. And even where there had been 2 languages that were legally the national languages of the country, the prime minister has been squeezing everybody into using just one. And instead of allowing for the broad practice of different faiths, 220 million people in the country have been told look, if they don't like the move towards one faith, they might as well go ahead and leave. Oh my goodness. What we're watching is something very similar to what we see in Genesis 11. There is a push to empire and a colonial control using language, eradicating faith, save for one faith. And instead of it being a good thing, it reshapes people and erodes their life. The writer of Genesis is saying, watch out for that. That happens formally. Governments do that. They put in new policies that seem reasonable on the surface, but at the end of the day, don't bring any happiness. Is it a problem with the technology? No, it's never been about the technology. What the writer of Genesis is saying is behind the activities, there is ambition, there is arrogance, there is a quest for wealth, there is a desire to control the lives of people that people in power have such a hard time walking away from, and it destroys life. But there's one other area, in a more informal way, I want to highlight just a little bit. And this is an informal example. It goes way outside of governments. And that's one of the things that we're seeing right now in a new kind of colonialism, a new kind of empirical control, and it's within artificial intelligence. The high priest of it, and I'm not going to mention his name, I can give it to you later, but I want to avoid vilifying any one person because it's an entire move that promises so much. But the current high priest, 2023, he says this: what's coming may be the most impactful technology humanity has ever invented. In the Tower of Babel, it was bricks and tar and the firing of bricks. And this time he says, this is the technology that is going to change everything. But that's not all that he said. Next slide. But it will probably break capitalism. Next slide. And it could lead to the dispowerment of humanity or even human extinction. So if you've been paying attention to the news and to what people have been writing, artificial technology isn't a benign little new piece of technology. Even those at the very center of it who've been working on it say that it will fundamentally change every life, every job, and as a matter of fact, it may bring about the end of the human race. And the first time I heard this, I would just grin going, what? Oh, that's crazy. And the more I pay attention as they talk about it, it is a new technological elite where they're saying, get in line behind us. This is a wave that is going to wash over you, and life as you knew it is going to completely change. So set aside all of your old beliefs, set aside your religions, because as his co-founder said, it is though we are becoming gods. End of quote. Next slide. Just a month ago, this same fellow produced a new essay called The Intelligence Principle, and he said, I believe the future is going to be so bright that no one can do it justice by trying to write about it now. A defining characteristic of the intelligence age will be massive prosperity. And he repeats this several times through this relatively short essay where he says, you are going to find yourself so incredibly wealthy, richer than you ever imagined. Things are going to get better and better. There will be a few little oopses along the way, but society is going to be so far superior to anything that we've seen. And the whole time I'm reading this, I want to put my hands over my ears because it begins to sound like the Tower of Babel. Here, take on one language. Here, we have a new technology. We're going to be able to build bigger and bigger and build bigger buildings. It's going to change our lives. You're going to love it. Excuse me, when I hear things like this and the promise of prosperity, it begins to feel to me like a high priest's hat trick. Because currently what we're watching, what we're seeing in the world is increasing wealth by a narrow few. For example, next slide. Oh, before I show you those, I want to make my case a little bit more. What they are describing for us is something called permissionless innovation. What that means is we are free to continue to innovate wherever our innovation takes us, and we don't have to get permission from anybody. Not to any governments, not to any authorities. We are the captains of our own fate. This is not my phrase, this is their phrase. And when a select few begin to say, hold it, hold it, hold it, you are working on technologies that you can't fully explain yourself, that have all sorts of threatening possibilities. And you kind of boast a little bit that no one has the right or privilege to hold you back or restrain you at all. Next slide. Here are the two responses. One of the things that the innovators say is that, well, it's just impossible to curtail innovation. Innovation is just going to happen, so be quiet, just live with it. Here's the other thing they say. The public is too ignorant to tell innovators how to innovate. You know what the subtext is? Resistance is futile. Go along and just sit back and watch what all is going to unfold as we watch jobs and folkways and traditions and faiths all dissolve in this new age of prosperity. Prosperity? Next slide. Oh, okay. Let me give you the statistic that is so unsettling for me. As a result of the new wealth that has come with the growth in technology, currently in my country, 2% of the people, just 2%, hold the wealth of almost 30% of the entire country. Just 2%. And the bottom half, over 50% of the country, have only 4% of the wealth. What this is signaling is a pretty frightening inequality where we are being told that what is coming in the future is going to absolutely upend all of our lives beyond anything that we can imagine. But if patterns are tracking at all, instead of making lives better and richer, it may do just the opposite. Now, the point of bringing this all up with you today is not to be an alarmist, to have you go out and buy up copies of Technology Today or whatever magazine you're interested in, but it is to come back and see what God was saying to that original audience all those years ago is just as apt today. When people bring in brand new technology, they are promising so much. They are forcing us into a monolith, into one language and one people. And again, it's not the technology that I'm concerned about. is the whole mix of motivations and anxieties in the souls of people who are directing where everything goes. The ambition, the arrogance, the lack of humility, the overconfidence, and the under-reflection. The very sorts of attitudes and motivations that were going on a couple thousand years ago are still going on in human hearts today. And back all those years ago, God was speaking to people who were immigrants, people who were aliens or expats in new lands, and he was saying, be very careful how you view what's happening around you. Don't buy into all of the promises. Don't give in to all of the fears, but be absolutely vigilant. Because the Almighty does not put up with arrogance, overwrought ambition, a need for wealth, need to control forever. Eventually he breaks in, and all of those temples he turns into desert dust. And what's so interesting, is that now we're ready for Abraham. So we had Noah and the flood, and all of that freedom didn't work. And now we had the Tower of Babel, and all of that control didn't work. And God, instead of working with large nations, begins to focus everything down to one new guy. A guy far from home, a guy fairly lonely, probably the last person that you would ever expect that God would build a people from, and says, there, I'm not impressed with your technology. I'm not impressed with your accomplishments. I'm impressed with the heart of one person far from home who is willing to follow me. And in that way, this is like a giant funnel, and it brings us down to this person. Pay attention to Abraham, because your life can be like his. You're far from home, lonely, wondering if God wants to work through your life still. Sit down. Pay attention to him, because God wants to work through you. Will you pray with me? Father, it's an involved story, but it's a story that amazingly speaks with clarity to a society addicted to technology, wealth, power, and control. And you announce that you are not particularly impressed by even our most aggressive accomplishments. You are paying close attention to the heart of even one person. You did it then, you're doing it now, and you're speaking to each one of us. May your Spirit pry us open so that we might know you, we might fall in love with you more deeply, we might know your Son if we've never met him, but that instead of trusting in buildings and technology and wealth, that we would find our hope in you and your love for us. In Jesus' name, amen.